All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming. We have a very special guest this evening, Dr. Michael Boyle, who's from Montclair State University. And he does some very fabulous research in an area that we all talk about here, namely self-disclosure of stuttering. And he's going to talk about some of his most current research in that. So let's give him a look.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thanks for inviting me here to talk to you. It's really nice when we can combine clinical work with research and consumers and just mix it all together. So I'm very excited to be here to share some of the research that I'm doing. So like Heather said, I'm a faculty member at Montclair State. So I teach the up-and-coming graduate students about stuttering and fluency disorders, and I also do research in this area. And my research tends to be in kind of the social and psychological aspects of stuttering, like how it impacts a person, feelings of stigma, both external, like out there in the public, as well as how it's internalized. Also things like quality of life and communicative participation in people who stutter, and looking at variables that predict those outcomes, and so if we can find out what's important. So the topic of this talk, though, is really focused on something quite narrow, which is disclosure. Heather and I were talking before this that it's kind of funny because a lot of people in our field in speech-language pathology talk about disclosure in stuttering. It's very much talked about. People have heard the term a lot, but there's not a whole lot of research on it. And it's nice to get that external research just as a way to support what's done clinically, to help professionals to help their clients better in terms of making decisions about disclosure and how it's done and so on and so forth. So I think this is a really applicable discussion that can have an impact on therapy. So over the past few years, just in general, I'll go through some of the main points of what the research has been showing us over the past couple of years. In this handout, which is double-sided, has the most pertinent points on it. Just sort of a summary of what I'll be talking about. So you can follow along if you want. If it's helpful. If not, you can just listen to me now and save this for later. But I wanted you to have something physical that you can take home with you that has all the key points, so that you don't just forget all this stuff. So because it's a lot to remember. So the first thing that I'll talk about is my colleagues and my students and I at Montclair State have been doing some work on disclosure, and specifically just ways that we can improve public attitudes about stuttering, because that's an area of research that's really kind of under-documented. There's not a lot out there. Everybody says, yeah, it's important to change the public attitudes and change the environment for the better, but there's not a lot of guidance out there about how do we actually do that. That's backed up by data. So I wanted to do a study where we could actually get some empirical support for some of these strategies. So there's a study there that cited that looked at a few different approaches. The first, and this is highlighted, I'll just kind of summarize these three approaches in this box here on that first page. The first one that we look at is called protest. So it's kind of like a reaction. It's if anything negative happens in the public, like somebody makes fun of stuttering in the media or on TV, or something happens like that, there's a pushback. There's kind of a protest of, you can't say that, how dare you say that, shame on you, and it's sort of like almost like a tone of righteous anger. And by the way, all of these were kind of looked at from the psychology literature, and specifically mental illness. So I didn't just make these up off the top of my head. These are strategies that come from the field of psychology. So we looked at that. We also looked at another approach, which is just called education, which is a little bit more neutral in its tone. It's not so aggressive, but it's just it lays out the facts, and it compares and contrasts myths and facts. So like as an example, there's a common myth that stuttering is caused by nervousness. Not true. Scientific research shows that people with stutter have a full range of personality traits, and there's really no good evidence to say that the root cause of stuttering is nervousness. That's not what we think as a field, yet it's a common misperception out in the general public. So you go through kind of a series of these myths, and then you contrast them with facts, and that's the education approach. And then the third one there, which is most relevant for our talk, is called interpersonal contact. And it just means that a person with lived experience with that condition, in this case, stuttering, talks to members of the public and shares their story and what stuttering is and how it's impacted their life and how you should interact with a person who stutters and things like that. So we actually compared these three approaches. We had people randomly, we had over 200 adults from all over the US who were randomly assigned to watch one of these videos. There's like a 5-minute video that we put up on YouTube, where it was sort of like a PowerPoint, or the contact one was actually just me talking for 5 minutes. And it was made according to the principles in the psychology literature. So it was very specifically crafted to include things that have been shown to be beneficial from the psychology literature. So there were lots of data from that study, and I won't go over all of it, but I think the important thing for this talk is when we ask people directly after watching these videos, we said, were these videos helpful in terms of changing your attitude in a more positive direction? And almost all of them said yes. And we compared across these different approaches, so protest, education, and contact. And the one that showed the most change was the interpersonal contact approach. They were all beneficial in certain areas, and we measured things like stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination, and also affirming positive attitudes as well. And they were all beneficial to a certain extent. But when you ask people directly, like not just the pre-test versus post-test, but when you ask people directly, did this change your attitude for the better and make it more positive? You got a more positive response in the contact group. So that's very relevant to disclosure, because what that is a person who stutters, who's talking about stuttering. And that appeared to be the most effective strategy compared to things like protest and education. So the bottom line with that study is that actually it appeared like the most powerful thing, according to the 212 participants, was having the contact with the person. And it actually wasn't live because it was recorded, right? But still, the idea of you're looking at a person who stutters and they're sharing their story, that had a more beneficial effect than the other strategies that were presented by fluent speakers, actually. That's the important thing about the other strategies, is that protest and education videos were narrated by a fluent speaker. So the only one with a stuttering speaker, me, and I was adding in more probably than I normally do, just like voluntary stuttering. So anyway, that's evidence right there that that's a strong approach, and it was a big change too. It was a big positive change, not just a small one. So that gives us some evidence for it. We did a follow-up study after that, which was more of a qualitative study. So we asked people in that survey, we said, if you said your attitudes changed in a positive direction after watching these videos, or this video, because they only watched one, what was it specifically about the video that led to your more positive attitudes? So we didn't just want to know which ones were effective and which ones looked like they were stronger, but why? What were the key elements in those approaches? And that's important to know, because if we know what the important aspects of it are, then we know, for example, to include them in future approaches. So what they said was, and this just focuses on the interpersonal contact. So we're not going to talk about protest and education anymore. That everything from here on is just talking about disclosure. So from the perspective of the public, they identified several key elements that were reasons for why they thought that their attitude changed in a positive direction. So I'm at the bottom now of this first page. So they said having a person with lived experience with stuttering and someone who stutters openly as the messenger, that was really important. And that's intuitive, right? Like that should be important, because the whole purpose of interpersonal contact is that the person has that condition. So in order for it to be contact, it needs to be a person who has that condition, who has lived experience. But they did make comments that it was powerful that it was a person who has experience with this who's talking about it directly. So that's one thing. They also said that the messenger came across as having a positive attitude and being confident and comfortable even when he stuttered. So that was an important theme. It was sort of like the attitude or the approach was positive, upbeat, even if stuttering was there, which it was definitely there to a moderate extent. They talked about the attitude of the speaker and how comfortable and confident they were. So that's important. They also talked not just about the speaker, but about the content of the message. That's the third bullet point there. They said that the message should include a description of lived experience of stuttering and struggles. For example, how stuttering can be a problem in everyday life and how it can have an impact on thoughts and feelings. So that was important to the participants as well, in terms of highlighting, this can be difficult. This is a challenge, and talking about some examples of how it's a challenge. Like when I go to say my name and somebody, laughs at me or something like that. And I think that's important also, just as an aside, because I think the word stuttering in our society has a lot of different connotations. A lot of people don't know what stuttering is, and they hear the word stuttering, and a lot of people say things like, "Oh, I stutter too sometimes when I'm nervous," or, "Oh yeah, that happens to me sometimes too." And they don't really understand that what we're talking about is not what they experience, which might be, yeah, they probably do have more disfluencies when they're nervous or stressed or tired. That's true, but it's not stuttering. That's a very different thing. So I think the stories here that kind of separate, it's like, no, this isn't just what happens when you get nervous or stressed sometimes. This is a qualitatively different thing that has a lot of negative implications. Like you don't ever go up to a person and literally not know if what you want to say is going to be able to come out. So I think making that distinction in people's minds helps them realize that we're talking about something different here, not just everyday disfluencies. So I think that's why that one was important. But the other important thing, and this is that fourth bullet point there at the bottom, is that the message should also include statements of attainment of goals. And in the psychology literature, they call this an on the way up story. So because you don't want it to just be negative, and here's how hard it is, and here's how challenging it is, because I think that if it's just that, the listener can come away, and actually their attitudes about stereotypes can be reinforced. If it's all kind of negative and talking about struggle and things like that, sometimes I think they might leave that thinking, kind of reinforcing a lot of the negative stereotypes in a way. So you can talk about the struggle, but also balance that with an on the way up story. Like, well, even though I stutter, I still talk a lot. I have a job that requires lots of talking, as an example. I went back to school, I did this or that. So highlighting things that are that go against the normal stereotype of stuttering. Like, let me just open this up to all of you now. Just as like a question to throw out there. What do you think are some of the common stereotypes about people who stutter? Like from the general public, people that don't know much about stuttering. If they think of a person who stutters, what do you think might be some of the stereotypes that might come to mind about a person who stutters? I'm curious.
Person who's shy and introverted.
Okay, so they're shy, introverted.
Not as intelligent.
Maybe not as intelligent or competent.
They aren't breathing correctly.
They aren't breathing correctly. Okay, so like if you were to just take a deep breath and things like that. Okay.
They just talk too fast.
They just talk too fast. They need to slow down and think about what they want to say, right?
That they're weird.
That they're weird.
Always nervous.
That they're always nervous,
How
right?
about lying?
Lying. Okay. So what are you hiding or something?
Yeah, right,
Yeah. Okay. So are any of the things that you mentioned, would you categorize them as positives?
The weird one.
Weird maybe, but yeah. So, but many of them you'd probably categorize as being undesirable. So that's not a good thing, right? It's kind of like you're trying to change that public perception and those negative stereotypes. So I think what's helpful about this is if we can kind of go against those, stereotypes. And if it's a person that appears to be positive and confident and things like that, that kind of goes against people's mental shortcut of, people who stutter are always nervous or shy or timid. So if you do the opposite of what's expected, I think that can be a powerful thing. That's reflected in the comments of the participants. And that last one there is also about the message itself, and the message of having what is called an affirmative goal statement for what the listener should take away from the interaction. So, for example, recommendations for how listeners can interact with people who stutter. Explicit instructions like, hey, when you're talking to me or when you're talking to a person who stutters, I would appreciate if you listen patiently and don't, cut me off. It may take me a little bit more time. I'd appreciate it if you maintained eye contact with me and just listen to the content of my message and just treat me like you treat anybody else. And so I included that in my little vignette there, video, and people responded to that and said that was something that they thought was very beneficial. Like, here's what I want you to do. Here's what you should take from this. I want you to, get this message. I want you to feel comfortable interacting with people who stutter. And so the other side of this then, one of the other points was a lot of the participants commented that they experienced more positive emotions when after they had seen this video. And specifically in terms of they felt like they'd be more comfortable interacting with people who stutter after hearing how should you interact with somebody? What is stuttering? Because a lot of people just don't know anything about stuttering, honestly, right? And they also said they felt an increased sense of empathy and compassion, knowing about the struggles that people who stutter can go through, how it's not easy. So the increased comfort, increased empathy and compassion, those are positive feelings. And they also said that an effective message, it sort of helped them realize that people who stutter are similar to everybody else, despite their disfluent speech. It just might take a little bit longer to say what you want to say, but fundamentally they're no different from anybody else. And if you really think about stigma, You know, in general, stigma at its core is very much like an us versus them mentality. It's like we're over here and those people over there are very different from us, and we don't like that difference normally. And it's labeled and it's stereotyped, and they can feel negatively around you, and they can treat you negatively because of that stigma. So this is sort of reducing that gap, because the message is, look, we're just like you. It just takes us a little bit longer to get out our message, but we're no different. Don't treat us any different. And hearing that message explicitly seems to really make people feel more comfortable and feel like there is less of a distinction, less of a dichotomy of an us versus them distinction. So that was another theme that came up as well. Before I go on to the next sort of study, any questions up to this point so far? Because I know that's a lot of information that packed into a few minutes, and before I go on to something sort of different, I just wanted some time to digest that and see if there were any comments or questions about any of that.
Maybe this seems off the side, but how long did it take to conduct that study and
research is always sort of, you know, funny, because it's like you think about how long it takes, and you think about the planning phase, which is honestly, it was like the longest phase was planning it. So it's probably about almost, I don't know, 6 to 8 months of planning it, or more, maybe like a year actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And then the execution of it was relatively quick, a few months maybe, and then the analysis of the data and writing it up and all that. So all said and done, a year and a half to 2 years maybe. This was done, it was planned in the fall and spring of, the fall of 2015, and even prior to that. It was executed in I think the spring of 2016. And then it took some time to get everything written up and published and analyzed and everything. But research is a long process. It takes a lot of time to plan and then do it and then analyze it all. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Do you think that the results would have been different if the stimuli were live people versus videos?
That's a great question, and yeah, it's something that it's like at the end of any study, you have, you know, it's funny, like people look at science like we're trying to find all the answers, and I always tell my students it's kind of like it's true, but at the end of any good study, you have like 10 new questions, half of which are more interesting than the one that you started with. So it's ongoing, like you just never end in terms of what can be asked. But that's one that we definitely thought of. You know, all these were videos, and they weren't in vivo, you know, like live. So there has been some evidence. There's a study by Tim Flynn and Ken St. Louis. You've probably seen this one. And they actually did something like this where they gave a class presentation about stuttering live, but they also had a condition where it was video. And the live, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, had strong results. There's some evidence, even though it's only one study, that if it's in person, that could even be maybe more powerful. So we had to do it like this just because of try to have everything very controlled and sort of similar. But the downside of that is that you limit it. You have to limit it, but it also leaves unanswered questions. So that's a question that we hope to look into later in terms of comparing those things. But there's reason to believe it's likely a bit more powerful in person because, you know, just like anything, if you're there in person, it tends to stick with you. You have some contact with the person live. You can ask questions. You can follow up with them, as opposed to a video where it's just like, I'll send this out, but you can't really interact with it. So there's reason to kind of hypothesize that the in-person would be strong. But that being said, there's still strong results even with video. So if we're seeing it with that, then there's potential for even stronger results if it was live. Yeah, okay.
How transferable are these results, since the only contact experience was with you, who's an articulate and educated male, you know, whereas with someone else it might not work quite the same way.
Yeah, that's another great question. It's certainly a limitation of the study. It's just, you're right, it was just me. And what was actually kind of funny about it was scripted, but because I had to include things from the psychology literature that have shown to be beneficial. So I wasn't just talking off the cuff randomly. It was very planned in terms of the content, but it had to come across kind of like it was natural. So I memorized the script basically, and I looked at the camera directly, not reading something, but just looking directly at the camera in a way that would replicate kind of like an interpersonal contact, just looking at the person. And I thought about, okay, well, let me get somebody else and I'll train them in what to say and how to do. And I just figured, well, you know, I may as well do it because I know the content is so well. But you're right, and we don't know. And if we had somebody else with any other different characteristic, how might that have changed things? We're not sure. So it's a great point. It's limited. But there have been some other studies that kind of support this as well. So outside of what I did, there's other studies that show in general that you know, some that have included women of different ages and different backgrounds and things like that. And results were also in general positive there. So we see some evidence across different studies, even though my study didn't include multiple people. There's some other evidence out there that would support the idea that it's beyond just me doing it. But
why did you choose for the protest and education stimuli to be fluent speakers versus versus a person who stutters, so then the only difference in interpersonal contact video would be the actual content.
right. So these are great questions, by the way. I should recruit you to help me plan my next study. A great, you know, that was something that we really thought hard about. It's a matter of kind of experimental control. So you try to kind of make them as distinct as you can. And the worry was if it was a person who stutters who is also doing the education and the protest, there's an overlap there in terms of, okay, well, if it's effective, you don't know, is it because of the content there, or was it because it was integrating some aspect of interpersonal contact as well? Because that speaker is the person who stutters, so you can kind of count that as contact. So because of the study, just in terms of, but you're absolutely right. It's kind of like, well, why couldn't you just combine them? And I agree that in real life, it's probably best if they are combined. But for the purposes of experimental control, we tried to make them as different as we could. So because if there's a lot of overlap between the groups, then it's hard to tease apart what the important ingredients were. So that was the idea.
What if the stutter, or what if the interpersonal contact one was was a fluent speaker talking about a friend who stutters? What do you think that would happen? What would happen?
Another interesting question. You know, I don't know, honestly. I just don't know. But that's a good idea for future work. Not sure. I would imagine it would be probably like if it was a parent or a friend or something like that. How that would compare to a person who stutters themselves, I just don't know the answer to it. Not sure. Yeah. Yeah.
This question is unrelated to the topic, but I noticed that when you speak, you seem very calm. So, what are some things that you have done like in the past to get to where you are now, in terms of like speaking ability?
That's a big question. I guess I would say, it's a process. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I think it's a lot of years of trying different things and a long, journey. I don't think you can simplify it to one thing, although in general, the theme would probably be that, and actually it fits right into this conversation, because honestly, it's about being open. I think when I was at a point in my life where I started to be a lot more open was when things really turned around. I had a lot of therapy when I was younger that was focused on fluency. I'm sure a lot of you can probably relate to this, right? Sort of like fluency. And for me, that just didn't do it. I knew how to do it, but there was more to the issue than that, as you know. So I think it was really a turning point when it was sort of just putting it on the table, being open about it. But that wasn't just like overnight. Even if you know that intellectually, that's one thing, but to live it is something else. And it's a process. It just takes time and growth and
Trial and error.
Trial and error, yep. And it vacillates. It goes back and forth. It's like you learn something and you think, okay, I got it now, right? And then like a year or two later, you find yourself back in the same spot. And so it's easy to kind of lose touch with the stuff that you've learned. So it's not a linear process. There's a lot of back and forth, but over the long term, it's been heading in that direction, I guess, where I would just say it's being open about it. But that is oversimplifying it a bit, because I do know about all the traditional speech language pathology strategies and fluency, all the tools that you've probably heard of. So I know all those things too. And those things are beneficial to a certain extent, but it's that combined with just kind of an attitude of being open about it. So it's not an easy answer, but it's sort of a long-term lifespan sort of, changes over time. So, yeah. Anything else at this point before we get into, so let's talk about some of the other literature here. So, so this is that second paragraph on the back of that page there. So concealment and avoidance of stuttering and speaking situations has been associated with lower levels of self-esteem in people who stutter, whereas increased openness and disclosure is linked to higher self-efficacy, increased social support, and also reduced feelings of time pressure to communicate quickly. That was something that Laura Plexico and her colleagues found in a qualitative study. And by the way, all of these citations in here, there are full references to at the bottom of that second page. So you can look these up, or I can share them with you if you're interested in the full copies of them. So I thought that was interesting, sort of like it's linked with, you can see research on this, it's linked with things like self-esteem and social support, and also feelings of reduced time pressure. So something about if you disclose to somebody else that you stutter, a lot of people say it reduces that burden of like, I have to do it quickly because they understand that I stutter. So I don't feel like I'm under quite as much pressure to have to rush, which is very helpful for a lot of people who stutter to feel like they have time, that they don't have to immediately say something. So that's also some relevant findings there. We just had a study that came out earlier this year in one of the major journals in our field that looked at the fact that quality of life. So if you ask a person, how satisfied are you in general with your life? How have things been going overall for you recently? And you have kind of like a global rating of your quality of life, meaning how you perceive your life to be going, your satisfaction with where you are compared to where you'd like to be. That is linked with increased disclosure. So if you look at the people who have higher quality of life scores, they also tend to have higher disclosure scores. And that's a study that just came out in the Journal of Fluency Disorders. There's free access to that one too for the next 50 days because it just came out. So maybe I can send that to you to even put up on the Facebook page because it's free. So why not? So that just adds some more support to when you're talking in therapy about, this has some positive correlations and things like that. We have data for all those things now, so that's nice. And then in a current study, which I again have to thank Heather for because she very kindly allowed me to come here over the summer to collect some data. So thank you again. And so a colleague named Rod Gobble, he's at the University of Toledo in Ohio. He and I are doing a study that's a qualitative study, meaning we're doing interviews with people who stutter, and specifically people who are very active in this self-help support world. So we're selectively trying to include people that we know who have reputations for being kind of outspoken about their stuttering and being out there about it, basically, and disclosing. And we're talking to them about, what does being open mean to you, and what are the pros and cons of it? How do you do it in a way that's most helpful to you? How do people respond to it? So we're just really kind of, delving into this idea of disclosure and learning about it from the perspective of people who actually live with stuttering and go through it every day. So there's a lot to this, and we're still analyzing it, but I just did a quick kind of run through a few weeks ago in advance of this talk, and there's some preliminary things. So I just focused on the question of how does it work best for you? In other words, what's the most helpful way that you have disclosed? What's the best way of doing it, do you think? And we sort of compared the best versus the not so good. And we're trying to look at what people who stutter say is most helpful to them in terms of how they disclose. So a few things that we found, a few people said to use humor. And again, it's not true of everyone, but we found a few examples of this. We interviewed 12 people so far. So the examples that I include here are sort of themes that we've seen across multiple people, not just one person, but theme with a few people talking about it. So a few people said to use humor and to not take yourself too seriously. Some people think it's helpful to state it directly without any elaboration. So something like, I stutter sometimes, or you might notice that I stutter. And they mentioned that it can be done preemptively, like before they stutter, or afterward. So afterward might be, you might have noticed that I stutter. So you can either say it in advance, before anything visible happens, or you can say it afterward. Like if you stutter and you think that your listener noticed and is kind of giving you the look, right, where it's like, you know, you can disclose that way and sort of, oh, you might have just noticed that I stutter. So very direct, very quick. And I should also mention before going on here that this is different from that first page where it was a 5-minute sort of like monologue. Because in most like everyday life situations, you're not going to have a 5-minute monologue. So the study on the first page was really about more of a setting, like if you went and you gave a talk and you went to like, for example, like Disability Awareness Month or International Stuttering Awareness Day, and you went and you gave a talk to like a local group somewhere. That would be where that first page really comes in, because it's extended period of time that you're talking. This second page here where we're asking people about disclosure is more like an everyday interaction where you're just briefly encountering people and meeting people. So it's kind of different. You're not going to have a 5-minute monologue normally, right? So I just want you to be aware of that distinction. So that third point there, a few other people said that they like to use statements that include educational elements. So for example, if you hear any pauses, that's what's going on. So, you know, I stutter. If you hear me pause sometimes and like nothing's coming out, that's what that is. So they're kind of educating them. It's a bit more elaboration in terms of what the person can expect. Here's what stuttering is. Here's what it might look like, just so you know. And they kind of let their listener know the intent behind the disclosure. So some people like to keep it very brief. Some people like to add the educational piece and why am I telling you this, right? Several people commented that just openly stuttering without any verbal disclosure or acknowledgement can be difficult because it still leaves everything up to the interpretation of the listener. And again, not everybody said this, but I think a couple people or 3 people said something like that. So they said addressing it directly with a statement reduces the ambiguity. So like, there are different ways of doing this. How do you disclose? You just, you know, talk and stutter like that and be open about it without explaining it? Can't you just do that? Or do you, like, even if you don't stutter, you can say, hey, I just, so you know I stutter, even if you're not stuttering at that time. Or you could stutter and say something like, oh, you probably just noticed that I stutter. So there's a lot of ways of going about it, but a few people said that they didn't like just stuttering without any verbal description, because they still felt like they said, you know, it doesn't really get me anywhere because I still feel like they don't know what's going on, and I haven't really addressed it directly. So for a few of these people that we talked to, they felt like it was really important not just to stutter openly, but to then acknowledge it with words. So, and again, not everybody, but some.
I find that one really interesting.
Yeah.
Personally, because only because so many people say, well, I'm stuttering, so obviously they know that I'm stuttering. So why do I need to disclose it when it's so obvious because I'm doing it?
Right.
And frankly, I think just like you're saying, I think that's giving the listener, frankly, too much credit to figure it out.
Right. Yeah. And so that a few people said that. It's sort of like, it doesn't really get me where I want to be if I just stutter, because it still leaves it ambiguous, because I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what they think this is. So for a few of these people that we talked to, that was important to them to have a verbal statement that was associated with the moment of stuttering instead of just stuttering. It's not to say that that's the only way of doing it or that everybody agrees, but it was just something that came out. And like you said, I hadn't really thought about it like that before. So that was interesting to me as well. We also had a few people say that tone is really important, and body language speaks, and it isn't just about a verbal disclosure, which I thought was really interesting. And people said things like, your body language needs to communicate that you're comfortable with it, and that you're looking at disclosure positively as something that you want to do, as opposed to something that you're being pushed into doing, or that you're doing it like an apologetic sort of way, like, like, I'm sorry, bear with me, give me time. That apologetic way consistently was something that people said wasn't very helpful to them, and that they felt like when it happens best is when they feel good about it, like they're doing it because they want to do it, not because they're being told that they should do it. And even though they might be saying, you probably know, I stutter, so as opposed to you'll probably notice I stutter. It's a big difference in terms of body language. So it's not just the words, it's how you say it, which makes me also think of the other study where the listeners commented on that as well, when they said what's also important is the body language and the tone and the confidence. So we're getting some triangulation here in terms of these different studies from both the public and from people who stutter, saying it works best when the person is positive and confident about it. They appear like they want to be disclosing it. So that's an interesting thing. And it sort of makes sense intuitively, because if you're not comfortable with talking about something, your body can't really hide that very well. And the person that you're talking to is probably going to feel like you feel, because they take their cues from how you, because they don't know anything about stuttering. So they're taking what you're giving them in terms of, well, this person, they seem to be very embarrassed about this, and they're not very comfortable with it. Therefore, I shouldn't be comfortable with it. So you try to, it's like if you can tell that a person's like, like, have you ever had that experience where you're listening to a talk or a presentation, and the person giving that talk is incredibly nervous, and they're like looking down, and you can tell that they just don't want to be doing it, right? And what does everybody do? They sort of look down, and because they don't want to, they feel like they're going to make that person feel worse if they're looking at them, and so it's just this negative cycle. So if the speaker comes across like they're actually enjoying disclosing or talking, that is something that is picked up on by the listener as well, and they're going to. So that's how I would explain it, and it's a pretty intuitive thing, but we have data that actually supports that now, so that's interesting. And then we also have people talking about disclosure indirectly through social media posts, like on Facebook. A lot of people said that maybe they're more comfortable by disclosing indirectly through social media, because it's, for some people anyway, it's kind of less awkward. They can have a post where, especially if a person is covert and they have a lot of old friends that they haven't talked to in a while and they never really talked about stuttering, instead of like, hey, we never talked about this when we were growing up, but I stutter, because a lot of people feel kind of odd about doing that. So if you post something on a page about stuttering and everybody reads it, it's sort of like, oh, okay, it's a way of doing it where you don't have to have the individual conversation with each and every person. So that was also something that came up as well. And I'll just also mention, there's a study that just came out by McGill and colleagues that identified 3 major types of disclosure. Educational, which is kind of what we just talked about. Like, you might notice that I pause sometimes. That's what this is about. It's stuttering. That's what that is. So they're kind of educating the person about what stuttering is. The other one was direct, where they just say, I stutter, and there's no explanation. right? So those are two different approaches. And the other one was apologetic, where it's kind of like, I'm sorry, bear with me, things like that. And it was interesting looking at the transcripts of these interviews, because some people just like very quick, direct statements, like hi, my name is so-and-so, and I stutter, and then just keep moving on. And it's very quick, like a sharp little jab. Instead, like you don't have to spend a lot of time on it. You just boom, move on. But some people saying that they like to explain it, and they like to add the education piece, or you might notice that I stutter sometimes. And so if you see, and they just add some extra information. So there's not one right way of doing it, but there's this difference across different people in terms of what their preferences are. And their preferences may vary between different situations too. It's not like you use the same exact approach in every situation. So I think at the end there, right before the references, I talk about just a few things that I think the results of all these studies can have in terms of clinical practice and clinical work. When we're talking with clients who stutter about disclosure, to weigh out the pros and cons, because I didn't get into this, but there are some cons too. And some people said, well, you know, because I would say, okay, well, we've talked about all the benefits of disclosure. Are there any downsides to it? And most, not everybody, but most people said, yeah, if I'm being honest, there are some downsides to it, including it opens you up to discrimination maybe, or that you're going to maybe get a reaction that you don't want. So, you know, if it was just as easy as being open, everybody would just be open all the time. But stigma is real. It's a real thing. You do get negative reactions sometimes. That's what compels people to hide it. They wouldn't hide it if they didn't feel like that wasn't beneficial sometimes too. And some people said, you know, sometimes I conceal it because it's easier. I don't expose myself to a negative reaction. So I don't want to completely highlight the positive without at least acknowledging the fact that there can be challenges to disclosure as well. If I didn't mention that, I'd be oversimplifying things, because we all know it's not just as easy as, oh, just be open about it. It's like, well, okay, great. But when you're at the job interview, this was one that I heard from a lot of people. It's like, do I disclose at a job interview? Because I know that it's good if I do, because they know and I can get accommodations, but they're worried about getting their foot in the door. And they don't want to start with that because they're afraid that if they know that I stutter, that's all that they're going to care about. And it will overshadow everything else. So a lot of people had concerns about, or like, you know, I had a few people actually mention things like a dating app or something like that, right? Where it's like, you include personal characteristics about yourself. Do you include the fact that you stutter if you're doing like an online, like a dating app? You know, and some people don't want to do that because they feel like, well, if I put that there, I'll be a snap judgment, and I don't want them to just breeze right over it because they see that one thing. Then you have the opposite argument, which is, look, if that's going to stop someone from wanting to get to know you, then you probably don't want to be around that person anyway. So that's a good counter argument. But there is debate about this. It's not all, you know, like black or white, you know, cut and dry. You do have to sort of weigh out the pros and cons. I don't think it's one thing where it was like, okay, disclose all the time in every situation. I think it's more nuanced than that. So I think that SLPs can kind of help their clients in terms of weighing out the pros and cons of disclosing in different situations. Like there may be some people where the response may be more negative or more positive. So it's nice to kind of talk, okay, well, what do you think would happen if you disclose this to this person in that situation? And talking about potential pros and cons so that they can really think about that. considering several different ways of disclosing in different situations. So just as we've talked about, there's a lot of options here in terms of how you go about disclosing. We talk about it like it's this like monolith in terms of like disclosure is one thing, but it's a lot of different things actually, and it can be done in many different ways. Do you just stutter openly, or do you stutter at a verbal description? Do you do it just verbally very quickly with no elaboration, or do you elaborate a bit and explain what it is? How do you do it in terms of your body language and your tone and that's important too. So kind of talking about those different ways of disclosing and what the person feels more comfortable with in different situations can be very beneficial. And then I think that speech language pathologists can help clients in terms of helping them to craft their stories. Like if it's just an everyday interaction and you're at like Starbucks or something and you're ordering coffee, you're not going to go on a 10-minute monologue about your stuttering to them. You're just going to have a quick interaction with them. But if you're giving a presentation, if you meet somebody new that you're going to be with for a long time to come, and you know, it's like those big situations where you feel like this requires more elaboration, and you can have a discussion with somebody about stuttering. How do you do that? So you can have a story that you write that you can do in a couple minutes where you hit the key points. And I hope that this research is helpful in terms of guiding people and maybe pointing to certain directions, like maybe consider including things like this. Here's the content that you might want to sprinkle in there. Here's what to be mindful of in terms of your tone and how you do it. So it's the combination of the message and how you express that message. And you can come up with your stories and write them out. Like if you had to explain your stuttering to somebody else in 2 minutes, what would you say? And actually write that out and practice it. And then you have those interactions like at a Starbucks or something where it's just really quick. And if somebody says something that's negative or they give you like the look or something, you can know how to respond to that just very quickly. You're not going to be going on and on about it. Just getting a cup of coffee. It's like, just give me my a coffee and I'll get out of here, right? But so you can have different responses and scripts for different situations. And it's nice to think about those things in advance, because in the moment they can be hard to think about because you might be stressed. You might get some negative response that might throw you off. So it's nice to think about it in advance. Like, what will you say? What would you feel comfortable saying? How would you say it? And like, I don't supervise clinic at Montclair State. I'm more in research and teaching, but I do consult with our students who are learning. And a lot of them will say, Dr. Boyle, can you come and meet my client? Because they just want the client to meet another person who stutters. And I say, sure, I always do that because I like doing it. And there are people, for example, who are dreading, like they have a class, they have to give a presentation. And it's at a university. So there's a lot of college students, obviously, and they have to give talks, they're going on job interviews. And, the clinician might be working really hard on the techniques and they're reading with the easy onsets and the light contacts and the slow rate, and they're really trying to get it right. And I sort of say sometimes, like, have you ever, this is all good stuff and it's great. Have you ever, at the beginning of the talk, just made a brief comment that you stutter? No, I've never done that. How would it make you feel, maybe, if you were to start with something? Well, I guess I'd feel a lot more comfortable because they would know what's going on. I wouldn't feel like I had to hide it, or I wouldn't feel like they don't know what's going on. And then say, okay, great. How could you make a quick statement to describe what stuttering is so that you can let the audience know? How would you do it? And it's really kind of nice because they're so focused on the speech motor aspect of it and trying to get the speech. It's like, if you disclose, it's not at all dependent on your speech. It's the message. It's not about if you're fluent or not. You can stutter a lot as you're doing it. But so I think that's really empowering to give clients these tools where there are things that you can do that can help you, that can help the audience, that can help the message, that have nothing to do with modifying how you talk. And that's a concept that's very foreign to a lot of people that assume that, okay, well, I have to give this presentation. I need to focus really hard on all the speech fluency techniques. Not to say that they can't do those too, but set the stage and think about what would it take to get you to feel really comfortable. And for a lot of people, starting with a quick message of disclosure can be very beneficial. And it's not written here, but just something I'll add on to that point, and then I'll open it back up to questions. A lot of people say that from the people that we've interviewed, when we ask them, like, what's the goal of disclosure? Like, what does it get you? You know, most people, from what we've found, talk about how it makes them feel, as opposed to what it does to the listener. Almost all of them have mentioned things like, it makes me feel better, it makes me feel like it's okay, it makes me feel comfortable. And some do add that, yes, it does help their listener because they can understand and so on and so forth. But the stronger theme definitely is internally. And I think that's an issue that we've been looking at in a very limited way, frankly. A lot of our research in our field anyway has looked at the effects of disclosure in terms of how the public responds. There's very little research that shows how disclosure impacts the person who's doing the disclosing. And it's like, well, that's pretty relevant, don't you think? Because it's you doing it, so it should make you feel better too. So that's what we're starting to, I think, hopefully show with this research, is that the primary benefit in a lot of ways is a psychological one that's internal to the person, even though it may have, as a byproduct, positive consequences for the public as well. So it's kind of like a double, it's a multiple effect. It's sort of like, if we look at all of this research together, we see that disclosure is very powerful, because on the one hand, it does seem to improve the public attitudes, as we've seen from that first study there. So there is empirical data to suggest that it does improve public attitudes, less stereotypes, less negative emotions, less discrimination, more positive affect. But the other studies interviewing people who stutter show that it's beneficial to them too. So it seems to be very powerful, because it can improve the public attitudes as well as improve how the person feels about him or herself. And I'll just end with, I promise I'll stop talking after this. If you think about it, it's really kind of empowering to know that, like, if you think back to the first study that I mentioned, where we compared protest education and contact, the one that was most beneficial, according to the participants, was the contact approach. But in order for it to be interpersonal contact, that requires people who stutter themselves to be open about it. So it's kind of like it all comes together, because it requires you to be open about it. And if you do, it can make you feel better, but it can also improve public attitudes and maybe make it easier for other people who stutter. If you educate, like if somebody laughs at you or says something negative, or what a great opportunity. Do you know anything about stuttering? No. Well, I'll educate you a little bit. And hopefully they'll never do that ever again. So you can kind of turn it from being on the defensive and, oh boy, I hope that they don't make any comments, to on the offensive, in terms of, this can actually help other people. Not just me, but it can help the community of people who stutter. But it requires that you're open about it, because you can't disclose if you're not open. You can't have interpersonal contact if you're first not open about it. So I know that like in my own, like it's tempting, like you think in every situation, do I really have to disclose every situation and be open about all the time? Can I just like order a cup of coffee and not have to get into this, right? You know, and that's completely valid. It just, if I think about it in this way, it helps me anyway, just personally, the fact that it's kind of a wider focus. It's not just about me and my stuttering, it's about people who stutter in general. And if you're all open about it, that has like a multiplying effect. And more people in the public are aware of it, they understand it better, and the next time they come across a person who stutters, it's less likely to be a negative response if it was to begin with. So that I think is a very empowering message and kind of how it all comes together. So I know that I've been talking for a long, long time. I'm sorry. I didn't plan on probably.
You just did an apology.
I just did apology. Right? Not very effective. So that's a lot to chew on. So any comments or questions about any of this from
Fabulous.
Thanks.
Do you think there's any difference in listener perception if the disclosure happens preemptively or after the person stutters?
Yeah, so I haven't done any of this in my own work, but there actually has been some research out there that, like, it was Charlie Healy and they might have, yeah. I think Charlie Healy and a few other people did one where they compared groups where it was like they changed the location of the disclosure message. So they had one that was at the beginning, one that was at the end. What would you guess would be the most effective one? Beginning, and it was. So yeah, there are some things we're starting to kind of, you know, piece this together here in terms of how do you go about constructing a good disclosure message. So at the beginning tends to be more beneficial in terms of attitude change. Yeah. Other questions?
What are your thoughts about the job interview question? Is there like a realistic risk to advertising that you still to your interview? Yeah.
Well, you know, technically with the Americans with Disabilities Act, you know, people aren't supposed to discriminate against you based on certain things. But that being said, in practice, we know that it can be a very different story because you don't get that call back. There's no reason why. And a lot of people that I've talked to say, you know, I stuttered quite a bit in my job interview and I never got the job. I felt like I was very prepared. I was very knowledgeable. I had great experience. And a lot of people think, well, geez, I wonder if it was the stuttering. But they're not going to tell you that. They're just not going to hire you. And you left to wonder because they could make up any reason for why. So I think it would be naive to say that there's no risk. Just from the people that I've talked to, they think it is a real risk and they think that they have been. They can't know for sure, but they suspect that it has been a factor. So there's not a clear answer to that. And I think I've ran into people who say that they would rather not disclose initially because they feel like they want to get their foot in the door. But then other people that say, I want this to be known up front because the longer I wait, the more awkward it will be later. So it's a tough issue. And that's probably the one issue that kind of splits the most people. Like even people that are really advocating for disclosure tend to have the caveat with the job interview. It's sort of like, need a job. This is really important. I'll do anything I can to get it. If that means I have to hide my stuttering, that's what I'll do. So,
you know, what's tricky about it is I think, you know, you have some people who in the process of not disclosing and hiding their stuttering, there are other tells, so to speak, that detract from their communication and from their message. And it's almost like 6 of one, half a dozen the other because, you know, I've known of people who after the fact have not gotten jobs and where the interviewer has said to them very frankly, well, you didn't seem confident in what you were saying. And in their own mind, they were like, well, that's because I was changing words around because I wasn't comfortable enough to touch my stuttering.
Right.
So I think, sometimes you kind of have to,
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
It's a common one that I've heard as well. It's like, even if because if you do try to avoid a lot and you like circumlocute, you change words.
eye contact.
Yeah. There's all those extra things that even though you're not stuttering in the way that you think is noticeable, there's a lot of other things that you're doing to hide it that actually might end up detracting more from your message than if you were to be open about it. So that's absolutely true. Yeah. Other questions, comments?
The common theme that seems to be running across a lot of what you're saying is how to manufacture the benefit of the doubt, how to create space, buffer space for you to exist and explore your speech and not feel time pressure, not feel judged. Wait, I was actually going somewhere with this. Right. This has broad applicability in professional settings whenever you deal with somebody different. Because whenever you have a process that is largely trained on a certain ethnicity of folks, gender, ableism, or whatever, it's tough to distinguish worse from different. And so your same instincts, having been trained across, say you're an interviewer. Your interviewing experience consists of 500 interviews of fluent people. All your instincts, all of what you think of as good has been honed by that experience. And so when you then deal with somebody different, and Heather's example of somebody who was really doing a bunch of word substituting, but the other person interpreted them as just being worse, less confident. These approaches that you suggest, confrontation, education, and so on, have the effect of manufacturing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Anyway, I hope that all makes sense.
Yes, it did. Thank you. Yeah.
In the quality of life research, do you think one of them comes first, or do you think it's more of a personality competence?
Well, we don't know from the data which one, because we can't really establish a causal link because it's just a correlation. And so people with higher quality of life, self-reported, also tend to report that they disclose more. Does disclosure lead to higher quality of life? Does higher quality of life lead to more disclosure? Or are they both caused by some other factor? So you can't really know that, although you could theorize that. I think that because if you look across the psychology literature, you can see that there's a lot of negative consequences to hiding something. There can be benefits in terms of you may not get discriminated against, but there seems to be very clear long-term negative consequences to hiding a stigmatized identity. More stress, more strained relationships, lower job satisfaction. So in the long run, there is and it's not just in stuttering research, but across the board, like concealable stigmas, that if you hide it, that really wears on you and it becomes like a secrecy cycle. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a causal link there, like if being open leads to a person feeling more satisfied. I just can't really establish that with those data, but that's what I would suspect. But there's probably other variables that lead to both. Like one thing that I'm curious about specifically for like a follow-up study is to look at why, what is it about certain people who stutter who disclose more and who get more out of it? Are they more extroverted? Do they have more self-esteem? And so trying to look at the characteristics of the person themselves to see, are people more likely to disclose if they have certain characteristics? And we don't know that yet, but I would suspect that there's probably something to that. Like why do some people choose to be very open about it and they get a lot of benefit from it, and some people choose not to be? And when they are, they feel very uncomfortable. Like what is the explanation for all that? And we don't really know yet, but I'd like to follow up on it. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever done an on-campus survey, like on Survey Monkey? Like anonymously about knowledge or just basic understanding of what stuttering is.
Yeah, I haven't done it on campus, but I've actually, a few years ago, I think it was last year, a national survey with over 300 adults from across the U.S. About that, about what their perceptions are, how they describe stuttering, what they think about people who stutter. So that was a pretty in-depth study that looked at kind of current attitudes, because there's been a lot of research on this, but it's always good to check in periodically because attitudes can change over time. So this was kind of a follow-up and also adding more information. But there's a lot of theories from the lay public about what stuttering is, and a lot of them aren't accurate. There's a lot of stereotypes out there, and but yeah, if you ask people like what they think stuttering is, a lot of them will talk mostly about the physical behaviors, and some people will actually comment on the struggle as well. So actually, a lot of people can kind of describe it, although some people's opinions are very misinformed. Some people might think it's because of like a mental illness or something like that. That's the minority of people, you know, thankfully, I guess, who just have ideas about it that aren't validated. Not to say that there's anything wrong with like mental illness, because that just, you know, magnifies stigma too. Frankly, if you say no, we're not like them, you know, it's like, well, that can hurt. That's not positive either, and so we have to destigmatize that as well, I think. But it's just a misunderstanding because it's not factually correct. It's not from that. So there's a lot of different opinion about it. But in general, it's sort of negative, I would say. If I were to sum it up, a lot of negative stereotypes. Not entirely, but if you were to compare it to perceptions of just any other person who doesn't stutter, they tend to be a bit more, you know, negative. And that's been true for a long time. Our research has shown that, and a lot of the survey studies.
Well, I would like to thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for
Thanks.
coming.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn off the recording now, so you can just chat at will. And please, you're not going anywhere, so if there's any more questions.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
You can stay for another 45 minutes or so.
Stop that.